The mud squelched between Elena's fingers as she collapsed onto her hands and knees, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of her torn dress like needles piercing her skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps that fogged in the bitter morning air, each exhale carrying with it the last vestiges of the life she had known. Above her, the iron gates of the Ashford Pack compound groaned shut with a finality that echoed through her hollow chest, and she heard the laughter, cruel, mocking, triumphant, of those who had once called her sister, friend, family. She could not bring herself to look back. Not at the faces pressed against the fence, their eyes gleaming with the sick satisfaction of witnessing another's destruction. Not at Marcus, whose scent still clung to her skin like a brand, pine and cedar corrupted by the bitter tang of betrayal. And certainly not at the woman standing at his side, her raven dark hair spilling over the collar of her crimson cloak, her smile a knife twisted in Elena's heart. Lyra Ravencrest had won. Elena's hands curled into fists, her broken nails scraping against the frozen earth as a sob tore from her throat. The sound was animal, raw, the cry of a creature that had been hunted to exhaustion and finally brought low. Her wolf, once so vibrant and fierce, lay silent within her, a cold absence where warmth had lived. Marcus had severed their bond with the ancient words, the ritual that dissolved a mating as thoroughly as if it had never existed. She could still feel the phantom pain of it, the tearing sensation as something essential was ripped from her soul. But that pain paled against the memory of what he had done before. Her fingers rose, trembling, to touch her scalp. Where once silver hair had cascaded to her waist, her mother's gift, her one true beauty, the feature that had made Marcus notice her in the first place, now there was only stubble and bare patches where the scissors had caught skin. She could feel the dried blood crusted at her temple, could smell the iron tang of it mixing with the mud and her own fear. "A whore's hair," he had said, his voice cold as the blade he'd wielded. "Fit only to be shorn like the animal you are." She had not fought him. That was the worst part. The shame that burned beneath her skin like acid. She had knelt before her mate, before her alpha, and let him destroy her piece by piece, while Lyra watched with gleaming eyes and the pack stood in silent witness. She had not screamed when the first lock fell. She had not begged when he grabbed her by the throat and forced her to look at her reflection in Lyra's hand mirror, to see the ruin he had made of her. She had only placed her hands over her belly, where 3 months of secret hope still grew, and prayed to the moon goddess that he would not discover the child. "Get up." The voice came from behind her, sharp with disgust. Elena flinched but did not move, her body refusing to obey any command. Footsteps crunched through the frost, and then rough hands seized her arms, hauling her upright. She swayed, her vision swimming, and found herself staring into the face of the gate guard, a man she had treated kindly once, when she was still the Alpha's mate, still someone worthy of respect. Now his lip curled as he looked at her. "The Alpha was clear," he said, his grip bruising on her upper arms. "You don't leave through the gate. Whores crawl out the back, through the refuse heap." He threw her, and Elena hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. For a long moment she simply lay there, staring up at the gray sky, watching her breath rise in small clouds that dissipated into nothing, the way everything she had believed about love and safety and belonging had dissipated in the span of a single morning. "Get up," her wolf whispered, the first stirring of life Elena had felt since the bond was severed. "Get up. The pup needs you to survive." The pup. Her hand found her belly again, pressing against the slight curve that her dress concealed. 3 months along, and no one knew. She had been saving the announcement for Marcus's birthday celebration, imagining his joy, his pride, the way he would pull her into his arms and declare to the entire pack that his mate was carrying his heir. Now that child would be born packless, fatherless, an abomination in the eyes of Wolflaw, the offspring of a rejected Omega, and the Alpha who had cast her out. If it was born at all. Elena forced herself onto her hands and knees, then slowly, agonizingly, to her feet. The world tilted dangerously, and she had to grab the nearby fence post to keep from falling again. Her body ached in ways she could not name. The dissolution of a mate bond was not meant to be survived, the healers whispered when they thought she could not hear. Most rejected wolves simply lay down and died, their spirits too broken to continue. She would not be most wolves. For the pup, she told herself, taking one stumbling step. For the innocent life that did not ask for this curse. For the child who deserves a chance to know the sun. The refuse heap was exactly where the guard had indicated, a sprawling mass of rot and decay at the back of the compound, where the pack discarded everything they deemed worthless. Broken furniture, spoiled food, unwanted mates. Elena climbed through it, the stench burning her nostrils, the sharp edges of discarded metal slicing her palms. She did not allow herself to think about the symbolism, about the message Marcus intended by sending her this way. She simply climbed, hand over hand, until she crested the wall of garbage and found herself staring out at the wild lands beyond, the borderlands. No pack claimed this territory. Rogues roamed here, wolves who had lost themselves to madness and bloodlust, humans too sometimes, hunters who had learned that wolf pelts fetched high prices in the southern markets. Elena had heard stories, whispered tales of women who wandered into these woods and were never seen again, their bones picked clean by creatures that wore the faces of men. But what choice did she have? She could not go to another pack. Word of her disgrace would have spread through the bond links by now, carried on the wind of gossip and condemnation. The Ashford pack was powerful, allied with 3 others in the Northern Territories. Any pack that took her in would face Marcus's wrath, and no Alpha would risk war for a discarded Omega with a ruined reputation. She could not go to the humans. They feared wolves, hunted them, locked them in cages, and sold them to collectors who wanted exotic pets. A pregnant shifter would be worth a fortune to the right buyer, or worth nothing at all, depending on their preferences. That left only one option, one desperate, impossible hope, the Alpha King. Elena had never seen him, this legendary figure who ruled over all the packs from his fortress in the eastern mountains. She knew only the stories, that he was ancient, powerful beyond measure, that he answered to no council and bowed to no tradition. Some said he was cruel, a tyrant who crushed dissent beneath his iron heel. Others whispered that he was just, that he offered sanctuary to those who had nowhere else to turn. His territory lay 3 days' journey to the east. 3 days through the borderlands, through rogue-infested forests and hunter-patrolled roads. 3 days without food, without shelter, without any guarantee that she would not simply be turned away at his gates, like she had been turned away from her own home. But 3 days was still a chance. 3 days was still hope. And hope, Elena realized as she took her first step into the wilderness, was all she had left. The forest swallowed her within minutes, the bare branches closing overhead like skeletal fingers reaching for the gray sky. Elena moved as quickly as her exhausted body would allow, putting distance between herself and the pack compound, listening for sounds of pursuit that never came. Marcus had made his point. He had no interest in hunting her, only in ensuring that everyone witnessed her humiliation, that the story of her fall would spread through the packs like wildfire. By nightfall, she would be a cautionary tale, the Omega who forgot her place, the mate who dared to look at another male, the whore who seduced her own sister's betrothed. None of it was true. Elena had never betrayed Marcus, never even looked at another wolf since the day of their mating ceremony. But Lyra's whispers had been so convincing, her evidence so carefully constructed. The letter Elena had never written. the witnesses who swore they had seen her with a male from the Thornwood pack, the scent planted on her clothes while she slept, that marked her as unfaithful. Marcus had not even given her a chance to defend herself. He had simply looked at her with those cold gray eyes and pronounced his judgment, and the bond between them, the sacred connection that should have told him the truth, had meant nothing against Lyra's honeyed lies. Elena walked until her legs gave out, then crawled until her arms failed her. She dragged herself to the bank of a frozen stream and lay there, gasping, her cheek pressed against the ice. The cold burned her skin, but she could not bring herself to move. Above her, the first stars were emerging from the darkening sky, cold and distant, and utterly indifferent to her suffering. "This is where I die," she thought, and the realization brought a strange calm. "This is where my story ends. In the mud, alone, with nothing to show for 23 years of life, except the child that will never draw breath." She closed her eyes and heard the footsteps. They were soft, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the bare branches, but Elena's wolf heard them, lifted its head, stirred from its death-like sleep, and listened with an intensity that made her heart stutter. Not rogues. Rogues moved with careless arrogance, crashing through the underbrush like they owned the world. These footsteps were disciplined, measured, the precise rhythm of soldiers on patrol. Elena tried to rise, to run, to hide, but her body refused to obey. She lay frozen against the ice as the footsteps grew closer, as torchlight flickered through the trees, as voices reached her ears. Male voices, deep and commanding. "Thought I saw movement near the stream. Could be a deer." Or a rogue scout. "Stay alert." "Sir, there's something on the bank. I think it's a person." The footsteps quickened, and then hands were on her. Gentle hands, careful hands, turning her onto her back with a tenderness that made Elena's eyes fly open in shock. She found herself staring up at a face half lit by torchlight, all sharp angles and dark eyes, framed by hair as black as the sky above. The man inhaled sharply, and his eyes flashed gold. Elena's wolf surged forward with a force that stole her breath, slamming against the inside of her chest like a caged beast scenting freedom. Warmth flooded through her. Warmth like sunlight, like summer, like everything she had lost and never thought to find again. She felt it spreading from her heart outward, melting the ice that had encased her soul, and she heard herself make a sound that was half sob, half whimper. "Mate!" Her wolf howled. "Mate! Mate! Mate!" The man's hands trembled where they cradled her shoulders. A low growl rumbled in his chest, almost subsonic, and Elena watched his nostrils flare as he inhaled again. Inhaled her, breathing in her scent like a drowning man gasping for air. His dark eyes had gone molten gold, the wolf rising to the surface, and for a moment Elena was certain he would claim her right there, would sink his teeth into her throat and complete the bond that screamed between them. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his jaw tight with visible restraint. "Impossible," he whispered. His gaze traced over her, taking in the ruined hair, the torn dress, the blood and mud and ruin of her. Elena felt shame burn through her, hot and bitter. This man, whoever he was seeing her at her absolute lowest. He was witnessing the destruction Marcus had wrought, the evidence of her disgrace. And yet, his hands did not withdraw, his eyes did not fill with contempt. He simply looked at her, really looked, and Elena saw something in his expression that she could not name, something that made her wolf whine with desperate longing. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice rough. Elena shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. The man nodded once, then shrugged off his cloak. Thick wool lined with fur, worth more than anything Elena had ever owned, and wrapped it around her shoulders. His hands shook as he tucked it around her, as his fingers brushed her collarbone, and she saw him clench his jaw against some invisible force. "I have you," he said, and then he lifted her into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Elena's head fell against his shoulder, her nose pressed to the junction of his neck where his pulse beat strong and steady, and his scent filled her lungs, pine and smoke and something wild, something that made her wolf keen with recognition. "Sir?" One of the other soldiers stepped forward, his torch held high. "What do we do with her?" The man holding Elena turned, and she felt the authority in his posture shift, felt the way the other soldiers snapped to attention. "We take her to camp," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "Summon the healers, and if anyone asks who she is—" He looked down at Elena and their eyes locked. Gold stared into gray, and for 3 heartbeats neither of them breathed. "Tell them she is under my protection." Elena's consciousness was fading, her exhausted body finally giving in to the warmth surrounding her. But before the darkness claimed her, she heard one of the soldiers whisper to another, "Did you see his eyes? I've never seen the commander react like that." "Careful, that's not just our commander. That's—" But Elena did not hear what he was. She only knew the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, the strength of his arms around her, and the impossible sensation of something like hope unfurling in her chest. She slept. Elena woke to warmth. It was such a foreign sensation that for a long moment she simply lay still, her eyes closed, her mind struggling to reconcile the soft blankets beneath her with the frozen ground where she had collapsed. The air smelled of herbs and wood smoke, of clean linens and something medicinal that made her nose twitch. And beneath all of it, threading through every breath she took, was his scent. Pine and smoke and wild mountain air. Her wolf stirred, lifting its head with an alertness that sent electricity racing down Elena's spine. "Mate," it whispered again, the word resonating through her like a struck bell. "He's close. He's here." Elena's eyes flew open. She was in a tent, a large one, its canvas walls glowing amber with the light of several oil lamps. The bed beneath her was narrow but comfortable, piled with furs that held the lingering warmth of a body recently departed. Medical supplies lined a small table nearby. Bandages, salves, a mortar and pestle still dusted with ground herbs. A brazier crackled in the corner, filling the space with blessed heat. And sitting in a chair beside her bed, his dark eyes fixed on her face, was the man who had carried her from the frozen stream. Elena's breath caught. In the flickering torchlight of the forest, she had registered only impressions. Sharp features, black hair, gold-flashing eyes. Now, in the steady glow of the lamps, she could truly see him. His face was all planes and angles, severe in its beauty, with a jaw that looked carved from granite, and cheekbones sharp enough to cut. His hair fell past his shoulders in a dark wave, tied back with a leather cord that only emphasized the powerful line of his neck. He was dressed simply, dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar. But there was nothing simple about the way he held himself. Even seated, even still, he radiated authority like heat from a flame. And he was watching her with an intensity that made her wolf whine. "You're awake," he said, and his voice rolled through her like thunder. Low, rough, carrying the weight of something barely restrained. "The healer said you might sleep through the night. It's only been a few hours." Elena tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She coughed, and he was there instantly, rising from his chair with fluid grace, pouring water from a pitcher on the side table, holding the cup to her lips with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. She drank, the cool liquid soothing her raw throat, and tried not to notice how close he was, how the warmth radiating from his body seemed to call to something deep within her. How her wolf was pacing restlessly, desperate to get closer. "Thank you," she managed when she had drunk her fill. Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The man set down the cup but did not retreat. He remained standing beside her bed, his dark eyes tracing over her face with an expression she could not read. This close, she could see the gold still flickering in his irises. Not the full blaze of transformation, but something persistent. Something that seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. "What is your name?" he asked. Elena hesitated. Names had power among wolves. To give someone your name was to give them a piece of yourself, to trust them with knowledge that could be used against you. She had given her name to Marcus once, spoken it like a prayer during their mating ceremony, and look where that had led her. But this man had wrapped his cloak around her shoulders, had carried her through the frozen night, had summoned healers and stood guard while she slept. "Elena," she said softly. "Elena Ashford." Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. His jaw tightened, and Elena saw his hands curl into fists at his sides before he deliberately relaxed them. "The Ashford Pack," he said. "Marcus Ashford's territory." It was not a question. Elena nodded anyway, and shame flooded through her, hot and bitter, making her want to turn her face away. Of course he knew. Everyone knew the Ashford Pack. And if word of her disgrace had spread as far as she feared, everyone would soon know what she had supposedly done. "I am not what they say," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I did not betray him. I would never." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sob that rose in her throat. This man was a stranger. He owed her nothing. Why was she pleading her case to him like a criminal begging for mercy? But he did not look at her with disgust. He did not step back in revulsion or call for the guards to throw her out. Instead, he did something that made Elena's heart stutter and her wolf howl with desperate hope. He knelt beside her bed. The movement brought their faces level, brought his eyes directly in line with hers, and Elena felt the full force of his gaze hit her like a physical blow. Gold blazed through the darkness of his irises, bright and molten, and a low sound rumbled from his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something in between. Something that made warmth pool in her belly and her skin prickle with awareness. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you are not what they say." Elena stared at him. "How can you possibly know that? You don't even know me." "No," he agreed, and the words seemed to cost him something. His hand rose, hovering in the air between them, not quite touching her face. "I don't know you. I don't know your past, your story, the path that brought you to that frozen stream. But I know." He exhaled sharply, his jaw clenching. "I know what I feel when I look at you. I know what my wolf is telling me. And my wolf says you are not a liar, not a betrayer, not the things they called you." The mate bond. Elena felt it now, really felt it. Not just the confused stirring of her wolf, but the actual pull between them, like an invisible thread wrapped around her heart and anchored to his. It was nothing like what she had felt with Marcus. That bond had been comfortable, steady, a warm presence in the back of her mind. This was a wildfire, a storm, a force of nature that threatened to consume her whole, and it terrified her. "Please," she whispered, shrinking back into the pillows. "Please, don't." The man's hand dropped immediately. He leaned back, putting distance between them, and Elena saw the effort it cost him, saw the tendons stand out in his neck, saw his hands grip his own thighs with white-knuckled force. His eyes flickered, the gold receding slightly, though it never fully disappeared. "I will not touch you," he said, his voice strained. "Not without your permission. Not ever without your permission. Do you understand?" Elena nodded, though she was not sure she understood anything anymore. Her world had been destroyed in a single morning. She had been cast out, shorn, branded a whore, left to die in the frozen wilderness. And now she was lying in a warm bed while the most beautiful man she had ever seen knelt beside her and promised not to hurt her, while the mate bond hummed between them, insistent and undeniable. It was too much. It was all too much. I don't. She shook her head, pressing her palms against her eyes. I don't understand what's happening. The bond, my bond with Marcus, it was dissolved. Completely dissolved. I felt it break. I felt. She choked on the memory, on the tearing agony of that severance. How can there be another bond? How can I feel this when I shouldn't be able to feel anything? The man was silent for a long moment. When Elena lowered her hands, she found him studying her with an expression that mingled wonder with something darker, something that looked almost like fury, though not directed at her. Mate bonds can only be dissolved if they were never true bonds to begin with, he said slowly. A true mate bond, a destined bond, cannot be broken by any ritual. It can only be completed or denied. He paused, and his throat worked as he swallowed. What you felt with the Ashford Alpha was not a destined bond. It was a choice bond, made by will rather than fate. Easier to form, but also easier to destroy. He hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly to her belly. The old stories say that a destined bond reshapes everything it touches, even blood, even bone, even life that has already begun to grow. Elena stared at him. And this? What we're feeling right now? His eyes met hers, gold blazing bright. This is fate, he said simply. This is destiny. This is the bond that was written in the stars before either of us drew breath. Elena went still. She had heard of destined mates. Every wolf had, growing up on stories of legendary pairs whose love had shaped the course of history. But she had always believed them to be fairy tales, romantic fantasies for young pups who hadn't yet learned how cruel the world could be. She had never imagined she might be part of one. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man held her gaze for a long moment. Then he rose to his feet, the movement fluid and graceful, and stepped back from her bed. The distance seemed to cause him physical pain. Elena saw him wince, saw his wolf flash behind his eyes, but he held his ground. "My name is Zephyr," he said, "and I am—" He paused, something complicated passing across his face. "I am the commander of this patrol. You are safe here, Elena. No one will harm you while you remain under my protection." But that wasn't the whole truth. Elena could see it in the way he held himself, in the authority that radiated from him like heat from the sun. The soldiers in the forest had been about to say something about who he really was. Before she could press him, however, the tent flap opened and a woman entered. Middle-aged, with gray, streaked hair pulled back in a practical braid, and kind eyes that assessed Elena with professional efficiency. "Ah, you're awake," the woman said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "I'm Healer Marin. How are you feeling? Any dizziness? Nausea? Pain?" Elena glanced at Zephyr, but he had retreated to the chair beside her bed, his face carefully neutral. Only the persistent gold in his eyes betrayed the intensity of what had passed between them. I'm all right," Elena said, turning back to the healer. "Tired, hungry, but nothing worse than that." Healer Marin nodded, approaching the bed with a tray of supplies. "That's to be expected. You were severely hypothermic when they brought you in, and dehydrated to boot. Another hour in that cold and we'd have lost you." She set down the tray and began unpacking items. A small knife, clean bandages, a jar of salve that smelled of mint and lavender. "I need to check your wounds. The cuts on your scalp, specifically. May I?" Elena's hand flew to her head, her fingers brushing the ragged stubble that was all that remained of her hair. Shame flooded through her, hot and bitter, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "It's all right," Healer Marin said gently, her rough hands surprisingly tender as she guided Elena's fingers away. "I've seen worse, child. Much worse. Now hold still." The examination was quick but thorough. Marin cleaned the cuts on Elena's scalp with practiced efficiency, her touch gentle despite her brisk manner. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the canvas ceiling, unable to bear the thought of seeing her reflection in anyone's gaze. And then Marin's hands stilled. "Commander," the healer said, her voice suddenly sharp. "Did you know about this?" Elena's heart stopped. Her hand flew to her belly, pressing protectively against the curve that her thin dress did nothing to hide. She had hoped, foolishly, desperately hoped, that the early stage of her pregnancy might escape notice. But Healer Marin had been examining wolves for decades. Of course she had felt it. The subtle changes in Elena's body, the particular quality of her scent that marked her as carrying life. Zephyr rose from his chair, his expression unreadable. "Know about what?" "She's with child," Marin said, and the words fell into the silence like stones into still water. 3 months along, by my estimation, maybe a bit more. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the condemnation. A pregnant Omega cast out by her mate. The implications were damning. Either she had been unfaithful, as Marcus claimed, and was carrying another male's bastard, or Marcus had cast out his own pregnant mate, which was a crime so monstrous that most wolves couldn't conceive of it. Either way, she was ruined. But when she dared to open her eyes, she found Zephyr's gaze fixed not on her belly, but on her face. And what she saw there made her breath catch. Not disgust, not condemnation, not even pity. Rage, pure incandescent rage, blazing in those gold-flecked eyes like a forest fire. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, the tendons standing out like cords, and a low growl was building in his chest, a sound that made Healer Marin take an unconscious step backward. "He cast her out," Zephyr said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Ashford Alpha cast his mate into the frozen wilderness to die. And now I learned she was carrying a child through all of it." "He didn't know," Elena said quickly. "About the baby. I never told him. I was going to, but it doesn't matter." His voice was low, vibrating with barely contained fury. "Pregnant or not, he threw his mate to the wolves. The child only deepens the crime." His eyes met hers, and the rage in them was so intense that Elena felt it like a physical force. "Whatever lies he believed, whatever crimes he accused you of, nothing justifies what he did." Elena stared at him, speechless. In all her imaginings of how others might react to her disgrace, she had never considered this. Never imagined that someone might look at her situation and place the blame where it truly belonged, on Marcus, not on her. "I was going to tell him," she whispered, her hand still pressed to her belly. "About the baby, on his birthday. I had it all planned, how I would announce it, how he would react." She choked on the memory. "Then Lyra came, and the accusation started, and I couldn't. I couldn't give him that weapon, not when he was already—" She broke off, shaking her head. Zephyr's expression softened, though the rage still burned beneath the surface. He crossed to her bedside in 2 long strides and knelt again, bringing himself to her level. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and intense. "That child is innocent. Whatever happened between you and its father, the babe carries no blame. And you—" He reached out, hesitating just before his fingers brushed her cheek, then withdrew. "You are under my protection now. Both of you. No one will harm you while I draw breath." The words should not have meant anything. He was a stranger, a man she had known for mere hours. But the mate bond thrummed between them, resonating with the truth of his words, and Elena felt something inside her crack. some wall she had built around her heart in the desperate hope of surviving. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Zephyr held her gaze for a long moment. Then he rose, turning away, and Elena saw his shoulders tense beneath his thin shirt. "Healer Marin," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "See that she eats. Something warm and substantial. And have one of the attendants bring fresh clothes. Something clean and warm." He paused at the tent flap, his hand gripping the canvas. "I will return in the morning to check on her." And then he was gone, the tent flap falling closed behind him, leaving Elena alone with the healer and the impossible weight of what had just passed between them. Marin was quiet for a long moment, her hands methodically repacking her supplies. Then she glanced at Elena with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and warning. "Do you know who he is?" she asked. "The man who just left?" Elena shook her head. The healer's lips pressed into a thin line. "That was Zephyr Blackmane," she said. "Commander of the King's Guard, High General of the Eastern Forces." She paused, her eyes searching Elena's face. "And Crown Prince of the Alpha King's bloodline. He is the Alpha King, child, the ruler of every pack in the realm." The words washed over Elena like ice water, and for a moment she could not breathe. The Alpha King. The legendary figure she had planned to throw herself upon for mercy. The distant ruler she had never imagined she might actually meet. He had knelt at her bedside. He had promised her protection. He had looked at her ruined hair and hollow eyes and felt the mate bond sing between them. "Fate," he had said. "Destiny. Written in the stars." Elena pressed her hands to her face and let the tears come. The days that followed passed in a haze of recovery and confusion. Elena was moved to a larger tent, one with a proper bed and a brazier that kept the cold at bay. Fresh clothes appeared each morning, simple dresses in soft wool, warm stockings, a heavy cloak lined with fur. Food arrived at regular intervals, brought by quiet attendants who treated her with a deference that made Elena uncomfortable. She was not accustomed to being served. She was not accustomed to being treated as anything other than a burden. And every night, without fail, Zephyr came. He never touched her. Never even sat on the bed where she lay. He simply pulled the chair close and spoke to her. Stories of his childhood in the mountain fortress, of the campaigns he had led, of the wolves he had known and lost and loved. His voice was low and rough, carrying the weight of centuries. For he was old, she learned, far older than his youthful face suggested. And Elena found herself leaning into the sound of it, letting it fill the silence where Marcus's cruelty had lived. On the third night she found the courage to speak. "Your hair," she said, her hand rising unbidden to touch the ragged stubble on her own scalp. "It's so long, so beautiful." Zephyr paused mid-sentence, his dark eyes finding hers in the lamplight. For a moment he simply looked at her, and Elena saw something flicker across his face, something that looked almost like pain. "Hair grows back," he said softly. "It is nothing but dead cells, easily destroyed and easily restored. But the spirit that survives such cruelty." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "That is what makes a person beautiful, Elena. That is what matters." Elena's eyes burned. "You don't have to say that. I know what I look like. I saw myself in Lyra's mirror. After—" She couldn't finish, couldn't speak the words. "I don't have to say it," Zephyr agreed. "But I want to. I want you to understand that what he took from you was nothing. Nothing compared to what you still possess." He reached out, his hand hovering above her scalp, not quite touching. "May I?" Elena should have said no, should have flinched away, remembered the last time a man's hand had come near her head. But the mate bond thrummed between them, warm and insistent, and her wolf was whining with desperate longing. She nodded. Zephyr's fingers traced through the air above her stubbled scalp, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, but never quite making contact. His eyes followed the movement, and Elena saw wonder there. Wonder and something fiercer, something possessive that made her shiver. "It will grow back thick and strong," he murmured, "silver, like moonlight on snow. And one day, when you are ready, I will brush it for you. I will tend it as the treasure it is, as you are." Elena's breath caught. "You can't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because—" She shook her head, pressing her hands against her eyes. "Because I can't trust it. I can't trust you. I trusted Marcus. I gave him everything. My love, my loyalty, my future. And he destroyed me. He took everything I had and threw it away like garbage." Zephyr was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I know," he said. "I know you have no reason to trust me. I know that words mean nothing from a man you barely know. So I will not ask for your trust. I will simply earn it. Day by day, action by action, until you know in your bones that I would sooner tear out my own heart than cause you pain." He rose from the chair, and Elena felt the warmth leave with him. "Sleep now," he said, moving toward the tent flap. "I will see you tomorrow." "Zephyr," Elena called, and he paused, his back to her. "The soldiers. They said something in the forest, about who you are. I didn't hear it at the time, but I know now. Healer Marin told me." He turned, his expression guarded. "And? Why didn't you tell me yourself? Why did you let me think you were just a commander?" Zephyr held her gaze for a long moment. Then something in his face softened, and he crossed back to her bedside, kneeling beside her once more. "Because I didn't want you to fear me," he said simply. "You had just been cast out by your alpha, abandoned by the man who should have protected you. The last thing you needed was to wake up in the tent of another alpha, wondering if history was about to repeat itself." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I wanted you to see me before you saw my crown. I wanted you to know the man before you knew the king." Elena stared at him, her heart aching with emotions she could not name. "And now that I know? Now?" Zephyr's lips curved into the ghost of a smile, the first she had seen from him. "Now I hope you will give me the chance to prove that not all alphas are monsters, that not all power corrupts, that perhaps—" He swallowed, the gold blazing bright in his eyes. "That perhaps fate knew what it was doing when it led you to my patrol that night." He rose before she could respond, moving toward the tent flap with long, measured strides. But at the entrance, he paused once more. "Sleep well, Elena," he said without turning. "Dream of sunlight and spring." And then he was gone. On the 5th day, everything changed. Elena had grown strong enough to leave her tent, venturing out into the camp with Healer Marin at her side. The soldiers they passed nodded respectfully, their eyes curious but not unkind, and Elena found herself relaxing by degrees. Perhaps she was safe here. Perhaps, for the first time in months, she could let down her guard. The thought shattered when she heard the voice. "So this is the Alpha King's new acquisition." The words dripped with contempt, and Elena turned to find a man approaching, tall, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. A noble, she realized, visiting the camp on some business or another. "I heard she was found by the border patrol, a stray Omega, heavy with another man's bastard." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "Sir Thornton," Healer Marin said sharply, "this woman is under the king's protection. I suggest you—" "Protection?" Thornton laughed, the sound ugly and mocking. "Is that what they're calling it now? I call it claiming spoils. Tell me, girl." He stepped closer, his eyes raking over Elena with undisguised contempt. "What did you do to catch his eye? Spread your legs for the patrol and work your way up? Something snapped inside Elena. Not her composure. She had lost that already. Something deeper. Something that had been bent for months under Marcus's coldness and Lyra's cruelty, bent until she had forgotten it existed. Her spine. My name, she said, and her voice came out steady in a way that surprised even her, is Elena, not girl. And you will use it. Thornton blinked. Behind her, Healer Marin went very still. Even the passing soldiers paused. I was the Ashford Alpha's mate, Elena continued, her chin lifting. I ran a household of 200 wolves. I managed trade routes, settled disputes, and bore every cruelty my mate inflicted without losing my mind or my dignity. You may call me disgraced if you like, but you will not call me weak, and you will not call me a whore. Thornton's mouth opened and closed, his rehearsed cruelties useless against someone who refused to crumble. He managed a sneer. Pretty speech for a cast-off? Enough. The voice came from behind her. Zephyr stepped into view, his eyes blazing gold, and the sheer weight of his presence drove Thornton to his knees before a word of command was spoken. But Elena noticed that Zephyr's gaze went to her first, not with protectiveness, but with something sharper. Recognition. Respect. My mate was handling this, Zephyr said, his voice carrying across the silent camp. But since you seem incapable of hearing her, let me translate. Leave this camp, and never let me see your face again. Thornton scrambled to his feet and fled without another word. The camp remained frozen for a long moment. Then Zephyr turned to face the assembled soldiers, and his voice rang out across the clearing. This woman is Elena Ashford. She is my mate, my destined mate, chosen by fate and recognized by the old magic. As you just witnessed, she is more than capable of defending herself, but anyone who forces her to should know that they will also answer to me. His eyes swept across the crowd. Is that understood? A chorus of voices answered him. Elena barely heard it. She was staring at her own hands, which had stopped trembling for the first time in days. Zephyr crossed to her side with careful, measured steps. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for her ears alone. I should have asked before making that announcement, but when I heard what he said, he paused. You were magnificent, by the way. Before I arrived. Elena was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over his heart. She felt it beating beneath her palm, steady, strong, racing with the aftermath of his fury. You called me your mate, she said. Yes. You told them all. Everyone knows now. Yes. He covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his chest. I know it changes things. I know you may not be ready for... Zephyr, she interrupted, and he fell silent. You stood up for me. You defended my honor. You threatened a nobleman because he insulted me. She shook her head slowly. No one has ever. Marcus never. I didn't know that. She trailed off, unable to find the words, but she did not need them. Zephyr seemed to understand. His other hand came up to cup her cheek, the first time he had truly touched her since carrying her from the frozen stream, and Elena leaned into the warmth of his palm. I will always defend you, he said. I will always protect you. Not because you are weak, but because you are precious. Because you are mine, and I am yours, and nothing in this world will ever change that. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the mate bond pulse between them, warm, insistent, patient. It had waited for her to be ready. It had given her time to heal, to trust, to believe. Maybe it was time to stop running from it. Okay, she whispered. Zephyr's brow furrowed. Okay? Okay. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. Let's see where this leads. Together. The smile that spread across his face was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Brilliant, transformative, beautiful. Together, he agreed. And for the first time since her world had shattered, Elena felt something bloom in her chest that she had never expected to feel again. Hope. The hope Elena felt lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days of Zephyr bringing her meals himself, his hand finding hers when they walked through camp, his eyes seeking her across crowded spaces. Marcus had claimed her with passion and possessed her with jealousy, but he had never simply cared for her, never noticed when she grew tired, never asked what she needed, never touched her as though she were something precious rather than something owned. Elena did not know what to do with Zephyr's quiet attention, except accept it with wondering gratitude. Word had spread quickly after his announcement, and the camp adjusted around her. The healers called her "My Lady" now. The guards bowed when she passed. Even healer Marin now approached her with a deference that made Elena uncomfortable. "You're going to be their queen," Marin said one afternoon, as she examined Elena's growing belly. "They're simply adjusting their behavior accordingly." Elena's hand flew to her stomach, where the baby had begun to move, tiny flutters that felt like butterfly wings against her palm. "I'm not going to be anyone's queen. You're the Alpha King's destined mate," Marin interrupted gently. "That makes you the future Luna Queen of all the Northern Territories, the most powerful woman in the realm, second only to Zephyr himself." She paused, her weathered face creasing with something that might have been concern. "You should prepare yourself, my lady. There will be those who resent your sudden elevation, those who had hoped to claim the king for themselves or their daughters." Elena thought of the nobleman Thornton, of the ugly words he had spat at her, of the hatred in his eyes. "I've already encountered some of that." What happened with Lord Thornton was nothing. Marin's voice dropped to a whisper. "He's a minor noble with no real influence. But there are others at court, powerful families, ancient bloodlines, who have been maneuvering for years to place one of their own daughters at the king's side. When they learn that a discarded Omega from a minor pack has claimed the position they coveted..." She shook her head. "Be careful, my lady. Not everyone will be as easy to defeat as a drunken lord with more pride than sense." Marin paused, then reached for an old leather-bound volume she had been consulting throughout Elena's examinations. She opened it to a page marked with a strip of cloth. "There is something else," Marin said carefully. "During your first examination, when I touched near the baby, I felt something. A pulse of energy, silver bright. I have been researching it since." She tapped the page. "The old texts call it truth light. It is a power carried in certain bloodlines, dormant until awakened by great need. The texts say it does not merely shield, it reveals. Lies wither in its presence." Marin closed the book and regarded Elena steadily. "I believe you carry this gift, my lady. Whether you can learn to wield it is another matter entirely." Elena stared at her own hands, remembering the faint glow she had sometimes seen as a child, the strange shimmer her mother had taught her to suppress. She had always assumed it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. The warning settled into Elena's bones. She was carrying one man's child while bonded to the Alpha King himself. She had shorn hair, an exile's reputation, and accusations of infidelity trailing her like a stench. The court would not see a survivor. They would see a whore who had entrapped their king. The thought made her want to run. But the mate bond pulsed warm in her chest, and she knew she could not leave Zephyr. She was caught between her fear of the future and her desperate need to stay close to the one person who had ever made her feel safe. It was on the 4th day that Lyra Ravencrest arrived. Elena was walking through the camp with Zephyr at her side, his hand warm against the small of her back, when she felt it. A prickle of unease that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Her wolf, still weak from the forced dissolution of her bond with Marcus, stirred restlessly, and Elena found herself scanning the tree line with sudden alertness. "What is it?" Zephyr asked, immediately responsive to her change in mood. I don't know. Something feels. She trailed off, unable to articulate the wrongness that had settled over her skin. Different. Wrong. Zephyr's eyes narrowed and she saw his nostrils flare as he scented the air. His hand tightened on her back, drawing her closer to his side, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Visitors, he said flatly, from the court. Elena followed his gaze and saw a procession emerging from the trees. A dozen riders on horseback, their mounts gleaming with expensive tack, their clothing marking them as nobility of the highest order. At their head rode a woman who made Elena's breath catch in her throat. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost supernatural. Raven dark hair that cascaded down her back in perfect waves, skin like porcelain, features so symmetrical they might have been carved by a master sculptor. Her riding dress was deep crimson, the color of fresh blood, and rubies glittered at her throat and ears. She sat her horse with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned her own worth, her own beauty, her own right to whatever she desired. But it was her scent that made Elena's wolf snarl in sudden, vicious recognition. She knew that scent. She had smelled it lingering on Marcus's skin, had caught traces of it on his clothing, had wondered where it came from and why it made her stomach churn with unease. It was the scent of crushed roses and something darker beneath, something that smelled like ambition and cruelty and calculated malice. Lyra, Elena breathed. Zephyr's entire body went rigid. You know her. I know her scent. Elena's voice came out strangled, rough with the effort of containing her wolf's sudden fury. She was. Marcus smelled of her. Before. I thought. I thought he was having an affair, but I could never prove it, and when I tried to ask him, he. She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Zephyr's growl deepened, and when Elena glanced at him, she saw that his eyes had gone gold. Lady Lyra Ravencrest, he said, and his voice was ice, one of the most influential nobles in my court. My scouts reported her departing the Ashford territories several days ago, heading south, apparently visiting allied pacts. She must have turned around the moment word of our bond reached her. She's here for me, Elena said, and she was surprised by how certain she sounded. How steady. I don't know how I know, but I'm sure of it. She's here because of me. Zephyr turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to cup her shoulders. Elena, listen to me. Whatever game Lyra is playing, you are under my protection. She cannot touch you. She cannot hurt you. I won't allow it. Elena wanted to believe him. She wanted to lean into his strength and let him shield her from whatever storm was coming. But she had spent too long being protected by men who ultimately failed her, and some part of her knew that this battle, whatever it was, would be one she had to fight herself. Just don't leave me alone with her, she said quietly. Never. Zephyr pressed a kiss to her forehead, quick and fierce. Never, Elena. You have my word. They stood together as Lyra's procession entered the camp, and Elena forced herself to straighten her spine, to lift her chin, to meet the other woman's gaze without flinching. She was shorn and scarred and pregnant with another man's child, but she was also the destined mate of the Alpha King, and she would not cower before anyone. Lyra dismounted with fluid grace, her crimson skirts swirling around her ankles, and swept into a curtsy so deep it bordered on theatrical. Your Majesty, she purred, and her voice was honey and silk, and something that made Elena's skin crawl. I returned as soon as I heard the news, a destined mate after all these years of searching. How wonderful for you. Her eyes slid to Elena, and the sweetness in her expression turned sharp. Calculating, predatory. And this must be the fortunate Omega, Lyra continued, rising from her curtsy with serpentine grace. Elena Ashford, isn't it? I believe I know your former pack. Such a humble origin for one who has risen so high so quickly. The insult was perfectly veiled, wrapped in courtesy so thin that acknowledging it would make Elena seem paranoid. But Elena heard it clearly, and from the tension in Zephyr's body, so did he. "Lady Lyra," Zephyr said, and his voice held none of the warmth Elena had grown accustomed to hearing. "Your timing is impeccable, as always. I was not aware that news of my mate had reached the southern territories so quickly." "Oh, news travels fast when it concerns matters of such importance." Lyra's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "A destined bond with a discarded Omega. Why, it's the stuff of ballads. The court is simply buzzing with curiosity." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The court. Word had already reached the court, which meant that everyone who mattered already knew about her past, about her shame. They would be forming opinions before she ever had a chance to speak for herself, building narratives based on rumor and speculation, and whatever poison Lyra chose to drip in their ears. "The court can wait," Zephyr said flatly. "Elena is healing. She will not be presented until she is ready." "Of course. Of course." Lyra's eyes never left Elena's face, cataloging every flaw, every vulnerability. "We must all be so careful with the new Luna Queen. So fragile after everything she's endured. I can only imagine how difficult it must be, carrying a child while forming a new bond. The strain on the body alone." She let the sentence trail off suggestively, and Elena's hand flew to her stomach in instinctive protection. The baby chose that moment to kick, harder than before, as if responding to her distress, and Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. "Enough." Zephyr stepped forward, placing himself between Elena and Lyra. "You will show my mate the respect she deserves, Lady Lyra, or you will find yourself removed from court entirely. Is that understood?" Lyra's eyes widened in theatrical innocence. "Why, Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect. I was simply expressing concern for Lady Elena's health. She looks so pale, so worn. Perhaps she should return to the healer's tent and rest." It was a dismissal disguised as solicitude, and everyone present knew it. Elena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, felt the eyes of the soldiers and servants watching this exchange with avid interest. This was how it would be, she realized. This was what her life would become. An endless series of battles fought with words and insinuations, an exhausting war of courtesy and cruelty. She was not sure she had the strength for it. But then Zephyr turned to her, and his eyes, still gold, still fierce, softened with something that looked like faith. "Elena," he said quietly, "what would you like to do?" He was asking her, giving her the choice, the agency, the power to decide her own fate. And in that moment, Elena felt something shift inside her, something that had been broken since the night Marcus had shorn her hair and thrown her to the wolves. "I would like to stay," she heard herself say. "I would like to welcome Lady Lyra to camp personally, as befits my position as the future Luna Queen." Surprise flickered across Lyra's face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough. She had expected Elena to run, had expected her to be weak, to be cowed, to be easily dismissed. She had underestimated her. "How gracious of you, my lady," Lyra said, recovering her composure. "Perhaps we might walk together? I would so love to hear about your experiences before coming to the king's attention." The trap was obvious. Lyra wanted to get Elena alone, wanted to probe for weaknesses and gather ammunition for the battles to come. But Elena found that she no longer cared. She had survived Marcus's cruelty. She had survived exile and starvation and the frozen wilderness. She could survive one ambitious noblewoman with too much time and not enough honor. "I would be delighted," Elena said. "Zephyr, will you join us?" The look he gave her was full of pride, and something warmer, something that made her heart flutter in her chest. "I would not miss it for the world." They walked together through the camp, Elena and Zephyr side by side, Lyra trailing slightly behind, and Elena felt the eyes of everyone they passed following their progress. She knew what they saw: the Alpha King, the discarded Omega, the powerful noblewoman. She knew the calculations being made, the alliances being considered, the gossip being formulated. Let them watch. Let them wonder. Let them talk. She was done being afraid. But later that night, when Zephyr had finally left her tent and Elena lay alone in the darkness, she thought about Lyra's scent on Marcus's skin and felt a cold certainty settle into her bones. Lyra Ravencrest had not come to welcome her. She had come to destroy her, and Elena did not yet know why. The answer came 3 days later in the form of a whispered conversation that Elena was never meant to hear. Zephyr had ridden out at dusk to meet a border patrol, a dispute with a rogue clan that required the king's personal authority. He would not return until midday. Elena had kissed him goodbye and tried to ignore the unease that settled over her the moment his horse disappeared into the trees. She had risen in the small hours, driven from her bed by the restless movements of the baby and a persistent nausea that had plagued her since the previous evening. Worse than anything she had felt during her pregnancy, a sick churning that tasted faintly of metal. The camp was quiet at this hour, most of the soldiers still sleeping, and Elena had decided to walk to the stream to splash cold water on her face. She was nearly there when she heard the voices, low, urgent, coming from behind a cluster of boulders near the water's edge. Can't simply kill her. The king would tear the realm apart searching for her murderer. Elena froze. Her wolf, weak as it was, snarled in alarm. I never said killer. That voice Elena recognized. Lyra Ravencrest, her honeyed tones sharp with irritation. I said eliminate the threat. There are ways to accomplish that without leaving a body. The child, then? Moonsbane in her food, like we discussed? Elena's blood turned to ice. Her hand flew to her stomach, covering the gentle swell where her baby grew. Moonsbane is effective, but slow. Lyra's voice was clinical, detached, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the murder of an unborn child. And if she survives, she might identify the taste. No, we need something more elegant, something that looks like natural miscarriage. The king would grieve, of course, but he would recover. And without the complication of Marcus's bastard, Elena's position becomes far more precarious. Elena could not breathe, could not move, could not think. Lyra wanted to kill her baby. Lyra wanted to poison her, to murder the innocent life growing inside her, to leave her broken and vulnerable and easily disposed of. You're certain this will work? The second voice was male, hesitant. The prophecy said, I know what the prophecy said. Lyra's voice snapped like a whip. A silver-haired Omega will bear the true king's heir and rule at his side for 1,000 years, but prophecies can be thwarted. Destinies can be rewritten. And I have worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let some pathetic cast-off Omega steal my future. Elena's hands were shaking, her whole body was shaking, tremors running through her muscles as the full horror of Lyra's words sank into her consciousness. It had never been about Marcus. It had never been about jealousy or competition or petty rivalry. Lyra had orchestrated Elena's downfall because of a prophecy. Because she had seen Elena as a threat to her own ambitions and decided to destroy her before she could become a rival. The king arrives at the capital in 3 days, Lyra continued. By then, the Omega will have lost her child. She'll be devastated, weakened, vulnerable. And when I suggest that the stress of her ordeal has proven too much, that she would be happier recovering in a quiet retreat far from court. A soft, cruel laugh. Zephyr will agree. He'll want to protect her after all. He'll want to spare her the difficulties of life at court. And then? And then she disappears. An accident, perhaps. A tragic incident with rogues during her journey to the retreat. Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. And I, of course, will be there to comfort the grieving king. to remind him that fate sometimes leads us astray, but true love finds a way in the end. Elena could not listen to any more. She backed away from the boulders, moving as silently as her shaking legs would allow, and fled toward the camp with her heart pounding in her ears. She had to tell Zephyr. She had to warn him about Lyra's plot, about the Moonsbane, about the conspiracy that would see her baby dead and herself exiled or murdered. But Zephyr was gone. Hours away, dealing with rogue clans at the border. And then the nausea hit again, that metallic churning, and Elena stumbled to a halt, her hand pressing against her stomach. Moonsbane is effective, but slow, the taste of metal in her mouth. The nausea that had started yesterday evening. The evening meal Lyra's attendant had served her with such solicitous care. They had already begun. Elena's blood went cold. She could send a rider after Zephyr, but he would not return for hours. By then, how much more poison would she have absorbed? How much damage would it do to the baby growing inside her? Lyra had said Moonsbane looked like natural miscarriage. Every hour Elena waited was another hour the poison worked. She could not wait. She could not afford to wait. But she was not powerless. Her wolf stirred inside her, weak but present. And Elena felt something else stirring too. Something deeper, older, more primal. A silver light flickered at the edges of her vision, and she remembered the strange glow that had sometimes emanated from her skin when she was a child, before her mother had taught her to suppress it. A silver-haired Omega will bear the true king's heir. Silver. Elena looked down at her hands and saw light glowing beneath her skin. Faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there. She had power. She had always had power. She just had never known how to use it. But she would learn. She would learn. And she would fight. And she would protect her child from anyone who dared to threaten them. Even if she had to do it alone. Back in her tent, Elena sat on the edge of her bedroll and pressed her hands against her belly. The silver light pulsed beneath her skin, answering her fear, her rage, the desperate protective instinct that had awakened the moment she heard Lyra speak of Moonsbane and murder. Her baby kicked against her palm. Elena closed her eyes and let the sensation anchor her. She had spent so long being afraid, so long cowering, accepting cruelty as though she deserved it. Lyra had counted on that weakness, had assumed Elena would crumble at the first sign of danger. But Lyra did not know about the light. And Lyra did not know that the poison she had slipped into Elena's food had done something she never intended. It had woken the power that slept in Elena's blood, stirred it to defend the life it threatened. Elena opened her eyes. Silver light spilled from her irises. She could feel her power now, truly feel it for the first time. Dormant all her life, waiting for the moment when she would need it most. Her mother had taught her to hide it, but Elena was no longer a frightened child, and she was done hiding. She dressed carefully, choosing the simple gray gown Zephyr had given her when she first arrived at camp. Not the clothing of a queen, but it reminded her of who she had been when she stumbled out of the darkness into his arms. A survivor. A fighter. A woman who refused to die. The camp was quiet as she stepped outside, the pre-dawn air cold against her cheeks. She could hear the distant calls of night birds and the soft murmur of the river, but the soldiers slept in their tents, unaware of the danger that lurked among them. Elena walked toward the great pavilion where the noble visitors were housed, her steps steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. Zephyr would not return until midday. The poison was already inside her. She could feel it now that she knew what to look for. A faint wrongness in her blood. A subtle cramping that had nothing to do with the baby. Every hour she waited, it worked deeper. She could not afford to wait for rescue. Not this time. The pavilion loomed before her, its canvas walls glowing faintly with the light of banked fires within. Elena paused at the entrance, her hand hovering over the flap, and took a deep breath. She could feel her power gathering beneath her skin, responding to her intention, ready to answer her call. She pushed through the entrance and stepped inside. The pavilion was larger than she had expected, filled with comfortable furnishings and rich fabrics that spoke of wealth and privilege. Lyra Ravencrest sat at a small table near the far wall, a goblet of wine in her hand, and a look of surprise on her beautiful face. She was dressed in a silk robe the color of blood, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked every inch the powerful noblewoman she claimed to be. But Elena could see past the mask now, could see the calculation behind those amber eyes, the cruelty that lurked beneath the honeyed smile. Lyra was a predator, and she had been stalking Elena from the moment she first heard the prophecy that named a silver-haired Omega as the future queen. Elena. Lyra set down her goblet and rose from her chair, her movements graceful and unhurried. What an unexpected visit. I would have thought you'd be resting, given your delicate condition. I know what you're planning. Elena's voice was steady, stronger than she had expected. I heard you talking by the river, the Moonsbane, the arranged accident. All of it. Something flickered in Lyra's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a flicker of concern, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a condescending smile. My dear girl, I don't know what you think you heard, but I assure you, don't. Elena stepped forward, and silver light began to pulse beneath her skin, visible even through the fabric of her gown. Don't lie to me. Not now. Not when you've already confessed your crimes to a witness. Lyra's smile faltered, just for a moment. Her gaze dropped to Elena's glowing hands, and something like fear crossed her features before she masked it with contempt. What is this? Some parlor trick? Some pathetic attempt to intimidate me? This is the power you tried to destroy before it could threaten you. Elena's voice resonated with something deeper than sound, something that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. The power of the prophecy you feared so much that you destroyed my marriage, my reputation, my entire life, just to prevent its fulfillment. Lyra's composure cracked. Her beautiful face twisted with rage, and she lunged toward the table where a small vial sat among her cosmetics. Moonsbane, Elena realized. The poison meant for her food. But Elena was faster. Silver light exploded from her palms, not as a weapon, but as a barrier, freezing Lyra in place with invisible chains of pure power. The noblewoman struggled against the bonds, her face contorting with fury, but she could not move, could not reach the poison that would have murdered an innocent child. You can't do this, Lyra hissed. I am a noble of the realm. I have connections, allies, people who will— You have nothing. Elena stepped closer, and her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than any shout. You plotted to murder the Alpha King's mate and his unborn heir. You conspired with others to commit treason, and now you will answer for your crimes. The pavilion flap burst open behind her. Zephyr. Returned early, she would learn later, because the mate bond had flared with her distress, and he had ridden through the night to reach her. She did not turn to look at him. She could not afford to take her eyes off Lyra, not when the woman's gaze was still calculating, still searching for an escape. Elena. Zephyr's voice was rough with emotion, fear, relief, something that might have been awe. What is happening here? Justice. Elena's power flared brighter, and she remembered what healer Marin had told her. The silver power doesn't just shield, it reveals. Lies wither in its presence. She felt something ancient stir in her blood, something that had been sleeping for generations, waiting for this moment. I invoke the truth light. As a pregnant Omega threatened by lies and conspiracy, I call upon the old magic to strip away deception and compel honesty from my accuser. Lyra's eyes went wide with terror. No, you can't. The old magic is lost. It hasn't been used in centuries. But the words were already spilling from her lips, dragged out by a force she could not resist. Her voice rose to a scream as the truth tore itself from her throat, confessions pouring out in a flood of poisoned words. I orchestrated everything. I paid a witch to read the prophecy, and when she told me that a silver-haired Omega would bear the true king's heir and rule at his side for 1,000 years, I knew I had to stop it. Tears streamed down Lyra's face, but she could not stop speaking, could not hold back the truth that Elena's power demanded. I seduced Marcus Ashford because he was Elena's mate, because I knew his weakness for flattery and his fear of being overshadowed. I whispered lies in his ear until he believed Elena had betrayed him. I convinced him to cut her hair and cast her out, to humiliate her so completely that she would never recover. The gathered crowd had grown. Soldiers summoned by the commotion, nobles awakened by the screaming, all of them staring at Lyra with horror and dawning understanding. I was supposed to be queen, Lyra's voice cracked, hysteria bleeding through the compelled confession. The prophecy said a silver-haired Omega would destroy my future, so I destroyed her first. I arranged for the Moonsbane, for the poison that would kill her child and leave her broken. I planned to have her murdered on the road to exile, to make it look like a rogue attack, and then I would comfort the grieving king and claim my rightful place at his side. Then the cost hit her. The truth light guttered like a candle in a gale. Elena felt it first as a hollowing in her chest, then as a sharp cramp that doubled her over. The silver bonds holding Lyra flickered and thinned. Her baby was screaming through the bond, a wordless distress signal that flooded Elena's body with ice. She was draining too much. The power was pulling from the same wellspring that sustained her child. Elena's knees buckled. The silver light around Lyra sputtered and died, and the noblewoman staggered free, her expression shifting from terror to vicious calculation in a heartbeat. "There it is," Lyra hissed, straightening. "The prophecy's champion. You can barely stand." She snatched the Moonsbane vial from the table. "All that power, and you're still just a broken Omega who can't even—" "Elena!" Zephyr surged forward, but Lyra was already moving, hurling the vial at Elena's unprotected belly. Elena had nothing left. No silver light, no ancient power, no strength in her trembling legs. She had only the choice she had made on the frozen ground outside the Ashford gates, when her wolf had whispered, "Get up," and she had listened. She chose her child. She dropped to her knees and curled around her belly, making herself as small as possible, shielding the baby with her own body. The vial shattered against her shoulder, and the Moonsbane burned where it touched her skin, but not her stomach, not her child, not the life she had sworn to protect. The pain was immediate and savage. Elena screamed as the poison seared into her shoulder, black veins spreading beneath her skin. But even as the agony consumed her, she felt her wolf rise. Not with power this time, but with something older and fiercer. The pure, animal refusal of a mother to let her child die. Zephyr caught Lyra before she could flee. There was no speech this time, no royal pronouncement. He simply seized her by the throat and slammed her to the ground with a force that cracked the wooden floor, his eyes blazing gold, his wolf barely leashed. Guards poured in around them. "The healers!" He snarled at the nearest soldier. "Get Marin, now!" Healer Marin arrived within minutes, her face going white when she saw the black veins crawling up Elena's shoulder. "Moonsbane," she said, already cutting away the fabric. "Applied externally, it's bad, but survivable. If it had reached the bloodstream near the womb—" She did not finish the sentence. Elena lay on the cold floor of the pavilion, trembling, while Marin worked. Through the haze of pain, she could hear Lyra sobbing, could hear Zephyr's voice, low and terrible, pronouncing sentence. Exile to the Shadowlands, effective at first light. Then sharper. She had an accomplice, A man by the river. Find him. Search every tent in the noble quarter. No one leaves this camp until he is in chains. She could hear the gathered crowd, soldiers and nobles who had witnessed Lyra's compelled confession, murmuring in horror. But she could also feel her baby kicking. Strong kicks, angry kicks, alive kicks. The child is unharmed, Marin said at last, and Elena sobbed with relief so violent it shook her whole body. Zephyr was beside her in an instant, lifting her carefully from the floor, cradling her against his chest. His hands were shaking. His eyes were red-rimmed in a way that told Elena the Alpha King had come very close to losing control entirely. "I almost lost you," he said, his voice raw. But you didn't." Elena pressed her hand, the one that wasn't burning, against his cheek. "And I didn't lose the baby. That's what matters. You shielded the child with your body." His jaw clenched. "You took the poison yourself rather than let it touch." He could not finish. He pressed his forehead against hers, and she felt the mate bond thrumming between them, vibrating with his terror and relief, and a love so fierce it bordered on pain. "I would do it again," she whispered. "Every time. Without hesitation." "I know." His voice broke on the words. "That is what terrifies me." Marin treated the moonsbane burns through the rest of the day, drawing the poison from Elena's shoulder with poultices that stank of charcoal and wolfsbane root. The black veins faded slowly, receding like a tide, and by nightfall the pain had dulled to a deep, throbbing ache. Zephyr did not leave her side through any of it. He held her hand while she slept, and when she woke in the gray light of morning, he was still there, unshaven, hollow-eyed, watching her as if she might vanish. Elena reached for him, wincing when her injured shoulder protested, and he was there instantly, his hands steadying her. "Careful," he murmured. "The burns." She kissed him, not gently, not tentatively. She kissed him with everything she had, because she was alive, and he was hers, and she was done waiting. When they finally broke apart, Zephyr rested his forehead against hers and spoke in a voice rough with need. "Will you let me mark you?" His hands trembled where they cupped her face, and she could feel the restraint it cost him to ask rather than demand. "I have been patient. I have tried to earn it day by day the way I promised. But I need to know. Will you let me be yours?" "Yes." The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a vow. "Yes. I will be your mate. I will be your queen. I will be yours, Zephyr, for as long as we both live." His eyes flashed gold, the wolf rising to the surface, and a low growl rumbled in his chest as he lifted her in his arms and carried her toward his tent. Elena wrapped her arms around his neck and breathed in his scent. Pine and musk and something wild that called to her wolf with irresistible force. The tent was warm and dim, lit by a single lamp that cast dancing shadows across the canvas walls. Zephyr laid her on his bedroll with reverent care, his hands stroking down her sides, as if she were something precious and fragile. But Elena was done being fragile. She caught his hands and guided them to the laces of her gown, her eyes holding his as she gave him permission to undress her. He took his time, peeling away each layer of fabric with aching slowness. When the gown slipped past her injured shoulder, he paused, his fingers hovering over the mottled bruise where the moonsbane had burned, his jaw tightening. He pressed his lips there, feather light, and Elena felt the mate bond pulse with his wordless fury at the wound and his tenderness despite it. Then he continued, pressing kisses to every inch of skin he revealed. Elena trembled beneath his touch, her body responding to him in ways that Marcus had never inspired. Not fear, not resignation, but genuine desire, genuine need, the mate bond singing in her blood as they moved together. When she was bare before him, he paused to simply look at her. His gaze traveled over the gentle swell of her belly, the curves of her breasts, the short silver hair that was finally beginning to grow back in soft waves. And his expression, the awe, the hunger, the absolute devotion in his eyes, made Elena feel beautiful for the first time in years. "You are exquisite," he breathed. "Every part of you, the scars, the curves, the strength that made you walk 3 days through rogue territory to save your child." Elena reached up and pulled him down to her, capturing his mouth in a kiss that left them both breathless. "You are already worthy. You were worthy the moment you wrapped your cloak around my shoulders and told me that hair grows back. Now stop talking and claim me." He laughed, the sound low and rough with desire. And then he was everywhere, his mouth on her throat, her collarbone, the sensitive place behind her ear that made her gasp. His hands mapped her body with thorough attention, learning every place that made her shiver, every touch that drew soft sounds from her lips. When his mouth found the junction of her neck and shoulder, he paused. His breath was hot against her skin, and she could feel his teeth. Not yet biting, just resting there as he waited for her final consent. "Tell me," he growled. "Tell me you want this. Tell me you choose me." "I choose you." Elena tilted her head to bare her throat completely, offering herself to him without reservation. "I want you. I want your mark, your bond, your claim. Make me yours, Zephyr." His teeth sank into her flesh. The pain was sharp and bright, a lightning strike that arced through her entire body. But in its wake came something else. Pleasure so intense it bordered on overwhelming. Warmth flooding through her veins like liquid gold. She could feel him, truly feel him, not just his body pressed against hers, but his soul, his essence, the core of who he was pouring into her through the bond. She felt everything he was, every fierce protectiveness, every ache of longing, every quiet joy he had swallowed during the nights he sat beside her bed and did not touch her. The bond stretched between them, a golden thread connecting their hearts, and Elena gasped as tears streamed down her cheeks. When he lifted his head, his eyes were pure gold, the wolf fully present. Blood stained his lips, and he licked it away with a satisfied growl that vibrated through her chest. "Mine," he breathed. "My mate. My queen." "Yours," Elena agreed. And then, with a strength she had not known she possessed, she flipped them over so that she straddled his hips, looking down at him with eyes that blazed silver. "But you are also mine, and a true mating goes both ways." She saw the surprise in his expression, followed immediately by fierce joy. He tilted his head, baring his throat to her in submission, a king offering himself to his queen, and Elena leaned down to press her mouth to the junction of his neck and shoulder. She bit. The sensation was different from this side, not receiving but giving, and yet the pleasure was just as intense. She felt her mark sink into his flesh, felt the bond snap fully into place, felt their souls entwine in a connection that could never be broken. Through the bond, she experienced his pleasure, his overwhelming love, his utter surrender to this moment. "Yours?" His thoughts whispered through their connection. "Always yours, forever yours." "Mine," she answered, "my mate, my king." Mate. They breathed together, and the word echoed through the bond like a sacred vow. Elena lifted her head and saw her mark on his throat. Silver, not the usual red of a mating bite, glowing faintly with the power that now bound them together. His mark on her throat pulsed in answer, and she felt the bond settle into her bones like coming home. They held each other in the aftermath, their bodies intertwined, their hearts beating in perfect synchronization. Zephyr traced patterns on her back with gentle fingers, and Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I love you," he said quietly. Through the bond, she felt the truth of it, vast and steady and certain. Nothing like the brittle intensity of what she had shared with Marcus. I love you too. The words came easier than she had expected. I did not think I could. Marcus convinced me I was incapable of it. But you? She pressed closer, feeling his heartbeat against her own. You made me remember who I was before the cruelty. He kissed her forehead. We will build something worth remembering. A kingdom where the broken find healing and the discarded find purpose. Elena smiled. I would like that very much. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the mate bond humming with contentment between them, and for the first time in months, Elena's dreams were not of darkness and pain, but of light and love and a future bright with promise. The coronation took place 3 weeks later in the great hall of the Alpha King's palace. Elena stood before the assembled nobles in a gown of silver and white, her short hair crowned with a circlet of moonstones that glowed faintly with her power. Her belly had grown larger, her pregnancy now obvious to all who looked, and she carried herself with the pride of a woman who had faced her demons and emerged victorious. Zephyr placed the crown upon her head, with hands that trembled slightly, his eyes shining with emotion as he spoke the ancient words of investiture. Before all who are gathered, before the gods who watch, I name this woman Luna Queen, my mate, my partner, my equal in all things. May her wisdom guide our people. May her strength protect our realm. May her love illuminate our kingdom for 1,000 years. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Elena felt tears slip down her cheeks as she looked out at the faces of her new subjects. Some had been skeptical at first, whispering about her history, about her former mate's accusations. But her confrontation with Lyra had silenced the doubters. Her power, her courage, her unwavering devotion to her unborn child, these things had won their respect. After the ceremony, Elena received a message from Marcus Ashford. He had heard of Lyra's confession, of her manipulation, of the truth that had been hidden for so long. He begged for her forgiveness, pleading ignorance and manipulation, claiming he had never meant to hurt her. Elena read the message once, then fed it to the fire. She did not need his apologies. She did not need his regret. She had moved beyond him, beyond the pain he had caused, into a future brighter than anything she could have imagined. Her son was born on a night of full moon, his first cry echoing through the palace like a promise. He had dark eyes that caught the moonlight with flecks of gold and the faintest wisps of silver-streaked hair. Healer Marin smiled when she saw it. The destined bond, she said simply, confirming what Zephyr had told Elena months ago in the healer's tent, that such bonds reshape everything they touch, even life already growing. When Elena held him in her arms for the first time, she wept with joy that knew no bounds. He is perfect, Zephyr whispered, his arms wrapped around them both, his lips pressed against Elena's temple. He is absolutely perfect. He is ours, Elena agreed, and the word ours settled over her like a blanket, warm and absolute. The darkest night of her life had ended, and this small, furious creature was the dawn. Zephyr traced the new growth of her hair, which now fell in soft waves to her shoulders, glowing faintly silver in the moonlight. You grow more beautiful with every sunrise. I think I am the luckiest man in all the kingdoms. Elena leaned into his touch, her heart overflowing with contentment. The mate bond hummed between them, a constant presence that reminded her she was loved, cherished, protected. She had found her destiny in the arms of a man who had seen her at her most broken and loved her anyway. I think, she said softly, that we are both lucky. Lucky to have found each other. Lucky to have survived. Lucky to have built something beautiful from the ashes of what was meant to destroy us. Zephyr kissed her, long and deep and full of promise, and Elena kissed him back with all the love in her heart. Outside their window, the moon shone down on a kingdom at peace, ruled by a king and queen whose love story would be told for generations. And Elena Ashford, once the cast-off Omega with shorn hair and a shattered heart, finally believed what she had never thought possible. She was worthy. She was loved. She was home.